Israeli soldiers who served in the war on Gaza dare to speak out. They say the Israeli army has committed widespread abuses against Gaza civilians. Israel denies the accusations and questions the reliability of testimonies. What is the truth and who's to blame for civilian death and damage? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mariam Namazi. Shoot first and worry later about civilian casualties. This is what some Israeli soldiers involved in Israel's war on Gaza say they were encouraged to do. The 22-day Israeli offensive on Gaza in January claimed more than 1,400 Palestinian lives. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and UN agencies have accused both Hamas and Israel of committing war crimes. Israel has rejected the charges and refuses to cooperate in the investigations. Now, the activist group Breaking the Silence has published testimonies from Israeli soldiers who say crimes were committed and even encouraged. They say civilians were used as human shields, entering buildings ahead of soldiers. Palestinian property was vandalized. There are reports of soldiers firing at water tanks despite a severe water shortage. Some soldiers say white phosphorus was used in civilian areas recklessly, and the report said confusion over rules of engagement led to an aggressive and ill-disciplined attitude among some troops. Dan Nolan reports.
First Sergeant Amir has been an army reservist for a decade, but his experience serving on a tank in Israel's war on Gaza has left him so troubled he's decided to speak out.
There were no rules of engagement. The only rules of engagement were to shoot.
He's one of 24 Israeli soldiers to provide testimony to Breaking the Silence, an organisation of Israeli veterans demanding accountability from their military masters. Almost 6 months after Israel's war on Gaza ended, the testimony sheds light on potential war crimes, including the targeting of innocent civilians.
We were told there are no innocents. Everyone is enemy.
Other soldiers didn't want to appear on camera, but they provided eyewitness accounts of 3 Palestinian civilians being shot and killed. One was an elderly man suspected to be a suicide bomber, but only carrying a flashlight.
The old man gave such a scream I'll never forget as long as I live. Everyone is shooting and shooting, and the guy's screaming. The next morning we sent out the explosive detector dog to sniff him out. The guy was clean, nothing on him, except for the torch in his hand, a white shirt and a long beard.
Some saw civilians forced to use sledgehammers to break into suspected Hamas houses before Israeli soldiers used them as human shields to enter.
In some cases, a civilian would be forced to walk in front of a soldier while the soldier placed the gun barrel on the civilian's shoulder.
In the aftermath of the war, people like Radi Abed Rabo made similar claims to Al Jazeera, which the Israeli army never responded to.
The Israelis were afraid of going into the houses, so they would send us ahead to tell people to evacuate. They made me dig holes in the wall and enter the houses first to check in case they were booby-trapped.
In its official statement, the Israeli army questions the accuracy of anonymous testimony. But military sources have admitted there were isolated incidents of unintentional harm to civilians due to operational errors.
We have no fear to investigate ourselves as we have done in the past. There are dozens of investigations that are still taking place now. However, since we did not have any factual database, we cannot pursue with investigation. I'm not saying there were mistakes, there were mistakes.
Breaking the Silence says it's not aiming to provide evidence of Israeli war crimes, but rather encourage a moral debate on what it calls a bleeding wound inflicted on Gaza. These testimonies show that Israel did violate the #1 principle in international laws of war. That is to distinguish between enemy combatants, who are legitimate targets, and innocent civilians and their property, which never are. Whether it leads to war crimes charges is unknown, but it's almost certainly destroyed Israel's long-running claim that its army is the most moral in the world. Dan Nolan, Al Jazeera, Jerusalem.
Well, joining us today are our guests in Jerusalem, Mikhail Manikin, an activist with Breaking the Silence group. Also in Jerusalem, Gerald Steinberg, the founder of the Programme on Conflict Management and Negotiation and the executive director of NGO Monitor. And in Strasbourg, Chris Davies, a Liberal Democrat member of the European Parliament and a human rights activist. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Mikhail Manikin, if I can come to you first. There have been endless reports about the Gaza war, but what makes this particular report different? Why is this report so important?
Well, what makes this report different is that it's told by 26 soldiers who served in Operation Cast Lead. The testimonies are anonymous, but it is soldiers who approached us, and we approached them independently, interviewed them independently, and give us their accounts of what happened in Operation Cast Lead. In some senses, it enforces reports that have been being published worldwide. In some senses, it gives different approaches.
Gerald Steinberg, what's your reaction to that? What did you make of the report? 26 different soldiers participating. They were all on the front line. They were all directly involved in the fighting.
Well, we don't know exactly what they were involved in. In fact, the Israeli military says some weren't involved at all. It's hard to judge. There's so much speculation. There's so many testimonies going all around. But if it's really only 26 Israeli soldiers out of thousands, and I've read the testimonies, and many of them say, I don't know exactly, I heard, it seemed to me, if this is the indictment of Israel, and there's no parallel indictment, my colleague, Mr. Manikin, where are the Palestinian equivalents of this? Where are the Hamas people who blow themselves up? This is a political campaign. It's funded by European governments. We wouldn't be talking about this. Mr. Manikin, nobody would hear of him if he didn't have so much foreign money coming in. This is really about politics. It's really about his own private agenda, and it's really about undermining Israeli democracy. He has a very strong moral principle, but there are no facts here. There's nothing that anybody can check. Just like the Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and all other reports, it's about condemning
Okay, well, you've
Israel
expressed some very
unfairly.
strong views there. Let me put some of that to Mr. Manikin. What do you make? What's your response to what Mr. Steinberg says, that this report does not address the actions of Palestinian fighters and therefore is biased?
Well, look, so many things have been said. I mean, we didn't interview Palestinians, so we're obviously not taking the Palestinian side. I want to say a couple of things to maybe contextualize the report. What we care about is Israeli democracy, and what we care about is Israel's moral standing. And instead of talking in the air about the testimonies, why don't I give a couple of examples so we can know what we're talking about? If a soldier describes operational use of white phosphorus into a building, and he gives operational justification. He says that the purpose of this white phosphorus was to blow up a booby-trapped building, which in fact did blow up and in fact was booby-trapped. But in a wider lens, we have white phosphorus being shot into a building. I don't think we can call this a case of one soldier, because a soldier doesn't decide to shoot white phosphorus. It's something which happens on a brigade level. So we are talking with 26 soldiers, but I think those 26 soldiers, sure.
Sure, you were speaking about getting into the specifics of the report. Mrs. Steinberg, what do you make of what the report says about the use of white phosphorus? We see in the report charges that have already been made before about the indiscriminate use of white phosphorus. One witness said that his battalion fired white phosphorus grenades from tanks. He said sometimes you'd hear on the radio permitted phosphorus in the air. He said, I know of one officer who also fired white phosphorus without getting permission. Asked by the interviewer why, the soldier answered, because it's fun.
If Mr. Manikin wants to make these charges and to improve Israeli democracy, that's a wonderful thing to do. And maybe some of these charges are actually accurate. Maybe some of the soldiers know what they're talking about. And maybe the circumstances, in fact, were very justified. Maybe it was to prevent the kidnapping and destruction of the Israeli soldiers, as happened to the Israeli soldiers in other circumstances where their body parts were kidnapped. And then use of white phosphorus as an obscurant is not just legal, but in fact, it's very much justified, and armies all over the world use it. But the fact is that this is not Mr. Manikin's goal. His goal is to condemn Israel around the world. He gets money from foreign governments to appear on Al Jazeera and the BBC and the Guardian.
Just one point that you make about the use of white phosphorus. This report actually suggests that it was used in a way that targeted civilians. But Mr. Davies, let me bring you in at this point. What do you make of that argument that we heard expressed by Mrs. Steinberg, that none of the soldiers in this report were actually identified? There were no dates or locations provided for the events that they're talking about?
Well, far from undermining Israeli democracy, I think this report must strengthen it. Certainly gives me a sense of just a reminder, really, of what's good about Israel, that there is the ability to discuss in this way, and there are many individuals serving within the IDF who just don't approve of the policies that they're being expected to carry out. And I think this report highlights that all too clearly. I'd just like to say thank you to the organisation breaking the silence for ensuring that the voice of the ordinary Israeli who dislikes the policies of his government and of his army gets heard.
Mrs. Steinberg, what do you make of that? That actually far from
undermining
I just add one thing? Democracy, that this
Mr.
actually
Davies
boosts
well
Israeli
known.
democracy?
Look, to hear something positive about Israel from Mr. Davies it's a very pleasant surprise. Mr. Davies is well known for being a virulent anti-Israel campaigner. He was forced to resign from his position as the leader of the Liberal Democratic group in the European Parliament after insulting Jewish leaders, a Jewish constituent. He always very often uses comparison of Israel with the Nazis, which as many of us are descendants from Nazi survivors, is the most offensive kind of terminology. I'm sure Mr. Mannikin could condemn that also. So perhaps Mr. Davies is going to change his tune a little bit. If we want to deal with the internal democratic issues and not to propagandize as he does. And so Mr. Davies would be well suited to just stop talking about Israel.
Let's just focus on the contents of this report that we're discussing specifically. And Mrs. Steinberg, let me ask you about what the report says concerning the rules of engagement. One testimony reads that the brigade commander went so far as to say that this was war, and in war no consideration of civilians was to be taken. You shoot anyone you see. The soldier says, I'm paraphrasing here, not literally quoting, but the gist of the matter was very clear. Isn't it worrying that soldiers say they were given rules of engagement which may well be illegal under international law?
I would love to see a world where Israelis and Palestinians and even Mr. Davies and his colleagues were totally moral. I think that we should deal with all evidence of immorality wherever it takes place, but this is not the case here. This is about a campaign to criminalize and demonize Israel. And Mr. Mannikin is part of that campaign. He's not helping his cause. If he wants to deal with this, Israel is a very open, very vocal democratic society. Mr. Mannikin is not going to be arrested, as he would be in most other societies in the Middle East, for daring to criticize. Whether his claims and the claims of the 26 soldiers that he found are accurate or not needs to be checked. And maybe some of them are. Maybe all of them are. Does that mean that Israel is a war criminal? Of course not. It means that there are a few people in any society who need to be disciplined. In any society, some people shouldn't be in the military.
Well, let me then put that point to Mr. Mannikin. What do you make of claims that have also been made by the IDF, that the issues you mention in your report were because of rogue soldiers rather than being systematic or widespread?
Well, look, I think anybody who made that claim didn't really read the report. And I will say that we sent NGO Monitor and Mr. Steinberg, Dr. Steinberg, excuse me, we sent the report ahead of time, so I hope it's with him already.
No, you didn't. We tried to get it.
Anybody who's actually,
but in the future, that's a good idea.
It's so it's in the mail. We sent it on Tuesday. It was I personally sent it.
We use
but
email,
to the issue at hand. To the issue at hand, anybody who's actually read the report and the testimonies are also online.
Michael, why did the British government pay for this? Why is the European Union paying for do you think they're paying you so much money?
Look, we have.
How can you explain that?
I'd be happy. Do you want me to answer? Look, we have.
You know,
I know what you promote
so many disgruntled Israelis. Why is you not...
Right, hang on a minute, Mrs. Steinberg, let Mr. Mannikin answer that without interrupting.
Yeah, what's odd about, first of all, I will answer the question. We're a registered NGO. I don't know of any organization on the left or on the right side of the political spectrum that doesn't get money from abroad. And I think we're being naive if we think that people work only on Israeli money. Look, back to the point specifically, and I know Dr. Steinberg promotes accountability, and I think that's a very important thing. Regarding the book, and if you've read the testimonies, and you saw that a lot of the soldiers who are speaking in the book are actually supporters of the war, retroactively as well. So we're not even talking about people who are necessarily against the incursion into Gaza. What they're stressing is that there are things in the war which happened which are problematic. Now, as a promoter of transparency and as a promoter of accountability, I urge you to call with us to open an investigation which is not happening only internally in the military. Maybe all these, I hope that all of these testimonies are false. I hope that all of these testimonies are false. Maybe all the soldiers that we spoke with are lying. Why don't we open an investigation? Why don't we open an independent investigation? Within the context of within the context of an independent investigation, we promise, breaking the silence, that we'll be full participants of that investigation. We'll share all of our testimonies. We're just not going to give them only to the military.
Mr. Davies, this isn't the first time that we're hearing about allegations of war crimes against the Israeli military. Special Rapporteur to the UN Human Rights Council, Richard Falk, said that the assault on Gaza appeared to be a war crime of the greatest magnitude and called on the UN to establish an experts group to investigate potential violations.
Well, war crimes come to a legal definition, so I'm not even going to get into the arguments because lawyers will take different positions. But I think what we do know is that while many people, and including myself, had sympathy with the Israeli argument that the shelling from militants in Gaza upon Israeli civilians was completely unacceptable and had, you couldn't expect the Israeli government not to react in some way. I think the end result of the incursion, as it's called, against Gaza was that not one single government in the world could approve of what Israel was doing and regarded it as a massive overreaction. And I think the impression that most people have, if you just simply add up the death figures, on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, 100 to 1 sort of comparisons have been made. You just say a massive overreaction where clearly Israeli forces just didn't regard the lives of Palestinians with anything like the same respect as they would regard the lives of ordinary Israelis.
Mr. Steinberg, what's your reaction to that this report shows that there was a completely disproportionate use of force in this war?
Mr. Davies is repeating figures that nobody knows the truth about. We don't know how many civilians were killed. We know that a lot of the people that the Palestinians said were civilians were actually Hamas members. That's the nature of this kind of war. All of the people in Gaza, 1.5 million people, were human shields.
You remember the majority of people in Gaza voted Hamas.
That's fundamentally immoral.
If you vote Hamas, you suddenly become a target for Israelis?
When was Mr. Davies, when 8,000 rockets were being fired for Hamas, why didn't he go to Sderot and say loudly and clearly, this is immoral? He could have saved a lot of lives.
I've been to Gaza. I've spoken directly with Ismail
You've been to Gaza. I said, have you been to Sderot?
And where was I? I have spoken in the past to representatives of Hamas, elected representatives, and said the shelling must stop.
I asked you a very specific question.
Mr. Steinberg, let me put one very specific point to you. In an interview with the New York Times, 33-year-old military reservist Amir Mamo, describing the rules of engagement for the Gaza operation, said that he was shocked with the way civilian casualties were discussed in training talks before his tank unit actually entered the Gaza Strip in January. He says, shoot and don't worry about the consequences was the message from commanders. That's pretty damning evidence, isn't it?
I always wonder what a Hamas suicide bomber trainee or one of Arafat's Fatah suicide bomber trainees said to their people when they sent them out to kill my children, to kill the people, the Israeli children in buses and cafes, over 1,000 people. There's such deep immorality in that, and yet the entire world, including this group, including Al Jazeera, including The Guardian, including the BBC, are focusing on claims that are made.
So you're saying that absolutely everyone is wrong?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we need to be universal about our moral claims and not always attack Israel, not from Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and Richard Goldstone's
Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have
cards.
actually pointed out that there were possible war crimes on both sides.
Yes, Amnesty used 8 pages out of 128 to sort of barely touch on the Hamas thing so that they can have a fig leaf. In the Human Rights Watch reports that come out that blame Israel for all sorts of things, using pseudo-technical language. There's no mention of Hamas. They haven't issued this report on Qassam rockets they keep promising. And Mr. Davies didn't go to Sderot to identify with all the Israelis whose lives were endangered, people who were injured and killed by over 8,000 rockets.
No,
if we're going to talk about morality, morality must be universal and equal for everybody, and this is not happening.
Well, Dr. Steinberg, I think, was introduced as representing some organisation to do with conflict management. Seems to me he intends to manage the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians like someone determined to stamp out a colony of wasps. But I was in Gaza just after the end of the conflict.
It's certainly not
I was in
mine.
Gaza during the course of the conflict. If you wouldn't mind, Dr. Steinberg, just letting someone else have a word. I was in Gaza briefly during the course of the conflict. I didn't have a chance, of course, to talk to soldiers, just UN officials. But I was there immediately afterwards, and I talked to business people who'd seen their factories, their biscuit factory, their ice cream factory, completely destroyed by the Israelis for no military purpose that anyone could possibly conceive. They had paid security guards to keep militants away so that Israelis could have no excuse. I mean, this is just part of collective punishment. It's just ensuring that thousands more people will be left unemployed, that people in Gaza,
where did these
1,500,000
rockets come
will
from?
have,
Okay,
will
well,
have
let
less,
me cut in at this point because we are
future.
running out of time. Mr. Manikin, given the nature of the claims that are being made in this report, does there need to be an impartial external investigation?
I think definitely what can be obviously said is that the military cannot investigate on its own, that there needs to be some sort of independent monitoring of that. And I think Mr. Steinberg would agree with me, because there apparently is nothing wrong with what happened in the Gaza incursion. And if there's nothing wrong, then what happened with the Gaza incursion? So why don't we show the world? Why don't we show ourselves? Why don't we show Israeli society?
Because
let Israelis come. Let independent Israelis who are accepted on all sides of the Israeli spectrum. I'm sorry, I can't speak. Can you wait 1 second? Not a trial, an investigation. We've had investigation pretty much on every incursion, every war that we've had since 1948. I think it's proper to have an investigation on this one as well. And again, let's prove these testimonies wrong. Let's be serious about our claims. Let's show.
Well, Mr. Steinberg, what's your response to that? Because we've heard this argument consistently from the Israeli authorities as well. That these are unsubstantiated allegations, but just because they are anonymous claims doesn't mean that they're true. Shouldn't there be an impartial investigation?
Let's investigate Hamas. Let's investigate the role of the media in this conflict. Let's investigate Hezbollah. Let's investigate Sri Lanka.
We're not talking about that. What we have here is anecdotal evidence of wrongdoing or war crimes. Why should we only investigate Israel?
We have clear evidence of war crimes.
Because
even
we're
Mr.
Israelis, and Israelis should
Hamas.
Investigate Israel.
Then why are we doing this on Al Jazeera, Mr. Manikin? Why don't we do this over a cup of coffee? Or why don't we do this in an Israeli forum? I'll be happy to debate you in an Israeli forum.
Well, we're very glad that the two of you are debating.
To focus on Israel in this environment.
I'll be happy to as well.
Where there's no fair
I'm happy
trial.
to speak with you in any forum.
Okay, on that note, we'll leave it there.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us in Jerusalem, Mikhail Manikin, also in Jerusalem, Gerald Steinberg, and in Strasbourg, Chris Davies. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.